Like he does every year, Nando v Movies has once again invited YouTube's best video essayists, and me, to contribute to a playlist of video essays, and this year it's the One Villainous Scene series, looking at some of the best villains of cinema. There are a lot to choose from, and while I would love to make a video about any one of these guys, for me, if you're going to talk about villains, then you have to talk about the late, great Christopher Lee. So yeah, we're going to look at Saruman. Specifically, the first scene with him, where Gandalf realizes that his friend and mentor has turned to evil. It's a brilliant introduction to the secondary villain of the Lord of the Rings series, and remains one of Christopher Lee's most iconic roles. It's widely known that Lee was a complete Tolkien fanatic, and had been for decades.
I never had to really talk to him about who and what Saruman was. He just absolutely knows his character.
His passion and knowledge of the lore underpins his entire performance, and I truly can't think of anyone better suited to the role than Lee. So it's ironic that the best known example of him correcting things on set didn't actually come from his knowledge of Tolkien.
I seem to recall that I did say to Peter, have you any idea of what kind of noise happens when somebody's stabbed in the back? And I said, well, because I do.
He used to be in the British Secret Service.
He seemed to have expert knowledge of exactly the sort of noise that they make, and so I just sort of didn't push the subject any further. I just said, well, you obviously know what to do, Christopher.
Now before we go any further, I have to take this opportunity to clear up a persistent urban myth, which is that Tolkien gave Lee his blessing to play Gandalf should the books ever be adapted to film. Unfortunately, that's not true. It is true that Lee was the only member of the cast or crew of the Lord of the Rings films to have met Tolkien in person, but that was fairly fleeting. Here's his account of it from a 2003 interview. I met him quite by chance, really. I met him with a group of other people in a pub in Oxford he used to go to. I was very much in awe of him, as you can imagine, so I just said, "How do you do?" That was it, I'm afraid. Tolkien never expressed a preference for casting of any hypothetical Lord of the Rings film, and certainly didn't know Christopher Lee well enough to have sanctioned him playing such a central character. No, the myth came about because Lee himself wanted to play Gandalf. It was truly his dream role, and when he was invited to play Saruman by Jackson, he insisted on being allowed to audition for Gandalf, and heavily pushed Jackson into letting him play the Grey Wizard. While I love McKellen as Gandalf, a part of me is desperately curious to see Lee's version of the character, but ultimately Jackson made the right call casting Lee as Saruman. He's a brilliant actor, but I think he lacks the warmth that McKellen brings to Gandalf that softens the character's rougher edge. But more importantly for Saruman, Lee brings with him decades of pedigree as one of cinema's most iconic villain actors. Jackson was heavily influenced by the Hammer horror films, of which Lee's Dracula was an iconic part. And let's not forget that he was one of the best Bond villains as well. This was also part of the reason that Saruman plays a much more active role in the movies than he does in the book. Having secured such a major star, they wanted to make the most of him by showing some of his scheming directly. So it's a shame that they didn't give him a proper send-off in The Return of the King.
I was very disappointed. I was shocked, I was disappointed, I was hurt. It's one of the most crucial scenes in the entire story.
I understand why they cut this scene from the theatrical cut, but I also completely sympathise with Lee and agree with him that it was important to give Saruman a proper conclusion, especially since they didn't include the scouring of the Shire in the films. He deserved better than an off-screen conclusion to his arc in the theatrical cut, and they could have easily trimmed down some of the Aragorn and Rohan scenes to fit it in. So before we look at Saruman's introductory scene, let's take a Tolkien geek side note and look at who Saruman the White is, because one of the reasons I think he makes such a good villain is because he didn't start out as a villain. Saruman, or more accurately Curunir, which means man of skill, was the leader of the 5 wizards, or Istari, who was sent to Middle-earth by the Valar to help counter Sauron. Oh yeah, I'm wearing the hat, which means I'm going to talk about Tolkien lore, so if that's not your cup of tea, then you can just skip to the next chapter. But if you're really fun at parties like me and enjoy talking about Tolkien lore, I'll carry on. The 5 Istari came to Middle-earth: Gandalf the Grey, Radagast the Brown, Saruman the White, and the 2 blue wizards, who basically bugged off to the east somewhere and are almost never mentioned again in Tolkien's Legendarium. To appeal to the free peoples, the Istari took the form of men, though in actual fact they are Maiar spirits serving as envoys of the Valar, which kind of makes them demigods, but Tolkien would probably prefer the term angel. Saruman was the head of the Istari, and later in the Third Age he came to lead the White Council. By the time period in which The Hobbit takes place, the council eventually decided to drive Sauron out of Dol Guldur, where he was hiding as the Necromancer. Now, there are of course many differences between book Saruman and movie Saruman. I won't get into all of them, but we'll briefly mention 3. The first is that in the book, Saruman does indeed become an agent of Sauron, but does so out of a desire to wield the One Ring for himself. Saruman believed that if he had the ring, he would be able to defeat Sauron and possibly rule Middle-earth. Now, I have no doubt that Lee's portrayal of the character was influenced by this knowledge, but the films never really suggest that Saruman wishes to possess the ring himself. The second difference is that in the books, Saruman began building up his army of Uruk-hai at Isengard decades before the events of the Lord of the Rings take place. The final thing is that he sheds the mantle of Saruman the White and becomes Saruman of many colours, another symbol of his desire for power, seeing as the colours loosely represent the power the Istari have been given by the Valar. I mention this because it would have been so cool to see in the Jackson films, but at least we got a hint of it in the Bakshi one, I guess. Okay, I could keep talking about this all day, but I should probably get back on track. What are we doing? Oh yeah, Villainous Scene, gotcha. In the first scene we meet Saruman. He is shown as a mentor and wise counsel for Gandalf, and the more senior of the two.
Your love of the halfling's leaf has clearly slowed your mind.
Gandalf reveals that he has discovered the location of the One Ring, information Saruman had been seeking for decades. Saruman, meanwhile, reveals to Gandalf that he has been communicating with Sauron through the Palantir and has learned that the Dark Lord is regathering his strength. It's at this moment, when we get a flash of Sauron, that Howard Shore's music begins and suddenly Gandalf realizes something is wrong. But it's too late. Saruman almost gleefully reveals that the Nazgul are already in the Shire. Seriously, look at how much fun Christopher Lee is having with this. As he speaks, the camera pulls right up to his face so we can see him deliver this killer line that immediately sets the stakes for the rest of the film.
I will find the ring and kill the one who carries it.
Gandalf goes to escape, but Saruman traps him, and here we get a glimpse of his arrogance and love of power.
I did not seriously think that a hobbit could contend with the will of Sauron.
This is the key difference between Gandalf and Saruman. Saruman believes in power and strength, while Gandalf can see that the purity and innocence of the hobbits is exactly why they are the only ones who could resist the ring. Saruman insists that Gandalf joined with him and Sauron, and here it's McKellen's turn to be the scene's alpha actor as he goes and delivers this sick burn.
When did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Now, I loved this Battle of the Wizards. I know some people think it's silly because it doesn't have much in the way of visual magic, but I actually think it's a really great example of the more understated and grounded portrayal of magic in Middle-earth. We can feel the power and blows of these attacks in a way that I think has more impact than if they had added some sort of CGI. Saruman shows his superiority by claiming Gandalf's staff, and wielding them both together, Saruman magically yeets him up the tower. Wait, hang on, how did Gandalf get his staff back? How have I been watching this movie for 20 years and never asked that? Anyway, I love this scene because it marks a clear turning point in the Fellowship of the Ring. Up to this point, it was mostly the Shire, warmth, greenery, and light. The Saruman scene even starts like this in the Gardens of Orthanc. But once this scene is over and Gandalf is captured, we the audience know the true nature of the threat facing the hobbits. The very next scene is their first encounter with the Ringwraiths, and once they have encountered the Black Rider, the remaining scenes almost entirely take place at night until they reach Rivendell. We only break away from this black, white, and blue colour palette for the best line in the trilogy.
We've had one, yes. What about second breakfast?
Every scene with Saruman is brilliant, but for me this first one perfectly sets up Saruman as the secondary antagonist for the next 2 films. Each time we cut back to him, we gain a new sense of the threat he poses and the power he has. This scales up too, from his spies and Lurtz's Uruk-hai gang, right through to the Wildmen, the Wargs, and of course the army that marches on Helm's Deep. His defeat at the hands of the Ents is also a brilliant moment of poetic justice, and this shot of Saruman realizing how much he messed up by forgetting about them is yet another perfect piece of acting by the late, great Sir Christopher Lee.
I have an enormous sense of pride at having been a part of this. It was my dream when I read the books, so dreams sometimes do come true.
I am so glad he got to reprise his role in The Hobbit and show us a different version of the character. Whatever the flaws of that trilogy, I actually got really excited seeing the White Council on screen, and I love that Lee got the chance to show us Saruman before he turned to darkness. Saruman is such a compelling villain both on screen and in the books because of the depth of lore and history the character brings with him. He's far more complex a character than Sauron, and Lee was the perfect person to bring him to life. So if you're watching the One Villainous Scene playlist and are wondering who the best villain is, well, in the words of Gandalf, it's Saruman! Thank you for watching and for indulging my Lord of the Rings geekiness once again. The next video is hopefully going to be another crazy deep dive fan theory, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoyed this video, then click all the buttons to let me know you liked it, and I'll see you next time. Namarie.